welcome to the Missoula Public Library. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to say a few thank yous, and I also want to read our land acknowledgement from the Missoula Public Library. Missoula Public Library sits on the ancestral homeland of the Bitterroot, Salish, and Kalispel peoples. Settlers acquired this land through dispossession and systematic attempts to destroy indigenous culture. Missoula Public Library is committed to providing a welcoming space for indigenous people, expanding indigenous engagement and access to library programs and services, and celebrating indigenous culture through programming, literature, art collections, and Salish language signage. I want to thank Fact and Fiction for being here. They're in back. Please buy a book from them. I also want to thank MCAP, a building partner in the library, for being here recording tonight's program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen.
Xavier, and we want to thank you for partnering with us on this event. Hi, I'm Karen Sturp, and I'm the CEO of the Jeannette Rankin Foundation. And the foundation is Jeannette Rankin's living legacy that came from a bequest from her land. And she wanted to help, quote unquote, mature unemployed women workers. So we give out scholar grants, unrestricted, to women, non-traditional students who are looking to complete their post-secondary education. And so far, we have funded $6 million in scholar grants to over 3,000 women across the United States. And even more exciting for y'all, I'll use that phrase, is the fact that we have 41 scholars here in Montana. We have scholars at all of the tribal colleges and at the University of Montana, and we have one of our alums, Robin, back there taking pictures, and this is Robin's picture up front. So she has already graduated from the University of Montana, first Salish and then the University of Montana, and now she works for HIPAX here in town. So yay, Robin. Well, tonight we're so excited to present Lorissa Rinehart and her new book, Winning the Earthquake. Jeanette is such inspiration for us, and Lorissa has really caught her life, her legacy, and the importance that of today, like bridging to today. And so I also want to introduce Chris Warden, but then again, I don't think anybody needs an introduction to him, right? Not in Missoula and maybe not in Montana? Yeah? Okay. He's a real history buff, and we are so grateful for him to be in conversation tonight with Lorissa. And we too want to do a ginormous thank you, first of all, to Chris's wife, Lori Warden, because this wouldn't have happened without her. And yes, amazing woman. And we have Rankin staff here tonight. So Michelle is standing back in the corner over there with Lori. And Betsy is a former board chair for the Rankin Foundation. And we have Luana, I think she was at the front desk. Yeah, Luana, come and wave at everybody. Yeah, they flew all the way from Atlanta for this. So we're so excited to do this. And yes, thank you to Fact and Fiction, and thank you to Xavier and the library for doing this. And we look forward to having a great conversation. I'm going to turn it over to you. They're going to converse for a while, and then there'll be about 15 minutes for questions, and then Lorissa will sign books afterwards. All right, thank you all, and I'm handing this over to you.
Oh, Karen, thank you very much. Thank you, Karen. Larissa, on behalf of Missoula, I want to welcome you to Missoula, Montana, Jeannette Rankin's hometown. You know, it is super fitting that Missoula is the first stop on this book tour, and let's just thank Lorissa and the Rankin Foundation for bringing her to this event today and to let us be the community that she kicks her tour off.
Yes, thank you so much.
So this is not the first book on Jeannette Rankin, but it's the first one in 20 years. And I started reading it a couple days ago, and I can put on a list like 5 books that I started reading and I could not put down. And what I'm excited about tonight is that you've really rekindled an interest for me, and I think you're bringing to life this wonderful legacy of a Montanan that we're all incredibly proud about. My first question for you is, before we kind of dive into the life and work of Jeannette Rankin, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? What had you gain interest in Jeannette Rankin?
So I am a mom and a writer of women's history, and particularly political American women's history. And what made me interested in Jeannette Rankin was part happenstance and part fate. So as I was telling someone in the bathroom earlier, I learned about Jeannette Rankin only recently, and I found out about her really because I was looking for a strong female American political figure to write my next book about. And she came up really in a Google search. And I could not believe, knowing just a little bit about her, that a book hadn't been written about her for 20 years, right? This seemed like an injustice. And not only that, and I read all of the biographies previously written about her, of course. And they're wonderful. They were all in smaller academic presses. And I really wanted to bring a popular history about Jeannette Rankin that was approachable and interesting to not a small subject, but a large swath of Americans, because you in Montana are so lucky that you know about her. But so few of the rest of us do, and I wanted to afford everyone the opportunity to learn about her incredible life and legacy. And so as soon as I started learning about her, I was just pushed all my chips in and devoted myself to this book. I'll often say, in truth, I gave myself a permanent B12 vitamin deficiency because I drank so much coffee writing this book, because I also have two small little ones, but I wanted to get it right. And so I would wake up, 5 o'clock every morning, go out to my little garden shed that I refurbished into a writing studio, and read prolifically, and then just wrote for months on end every single day.
Yeah, and you've done an amazing job.
Thank you.
Also, before we dive in, I always think it's nice to know a little bit about your audience. And I would imagine this audience is going to be special for you, and maybe a little bit different, because we're here in Jeanette's hometown. And I would imagine that most of the room has a pretty strong reverence and knowledge of Jeannette Rankin. Some might have actually known her, and some might be brand new. And I thought if people would just mind showing some hands, who here feels like they're really strong, almost a historian in Jeannette Rankin? Yeah, there is. I don't think any of the other previous book authors are, but some are from Missoula. They could be here as well. There's just a lot of rich interest in history in Jeannette Rankin. Who considers themselves kind of pretty well versed on Jeannette Rankin, but interested in learning new things? Yeah, so
Right, you're my
that's a
people.
good group. And then who's brand new? Who saw the sign? And so we have a few brand new people. So maybe we'll just start there. For those that are newer to Jeanette's legacy, who was she and why does she matter?
So I think first and foremost, Jeanette was Montana. I mean, so much of her is in this land. And I was very fortunate to be able to, thanks to the Jeannette Rankin Foundation and Chris, to be able to visit her, where she grew up today. And just seeing what she saw, walking the land that she walked, watching the clouds, seeing the mountains, really lent so much insight to how she was shaped, how her vision was shaped, and her understanding of the present, past, and future were shaped by this land. And, I guess in more critical or concrete terms, of course she was the first woman elected to Congress, but she was also a trailblazing grassroots organizer. She understood how politics works, how people work together, and how to move them forward toward a common goal. And she had an incredible vision for what American democracy might be that she really developed here in Montana, literally reading the Constitution by candlelight as a child, and then thinking about that while she's, bringing in the horses and helping plant vegetables and, going for hikes through the mountains. And that is so much of who she is. And then finally, I would say she was incredibly devoted to the idea of peace and the possibility of a world at peace with itself. And that was an idea and a mission that she really explored in the halls of Congress, in lobbying, in peace activism in the streets, and then also through, we can get into all of this in more detail later, but she spent a lot of her later years in India studying the nonviolent independence movement of Mahatma Gandhi, which really spoke to her on a deep investment level. And I'll just say one other thing was, you know, my second child, I named him Henry Dick. I named him Thoreau after Henry Dick Thoreau. And it turns out, and I named him before I started writing this book, and it turns out that one of Jeanette's heroes was Thoreau. And so I just felt this incredible connection that, you know, this writer, Thoreau, who shaped my worldview, was also someone to whom she related so much. And that's another sort of connection point between us that made me so grateful to write this book.
Yeah, it was really fun kind of walking in Jeanette's footsteps with you today. For those of you that aren't familiar, we started our morning at the Market on Front, which is approximately the footprint of where the Rankin Hotel was at. And then we drove down the street to Madison, and part of the Rankin property is now the road. But if you know where that Jiffy Lube is and the overflow parking lot for the Doubletree Hotel, that's where the Rankin home was at. This is a beautiful stately home. All we could see was the backdrop that you mentioned in your book of Mount Jumbo kind of dominating the backdrop. It was beautiful to see that. And then we got to go up to the Rankin Ranch, and thank you to Penny Kouth and the Washington family for letting us do that today. They've taken such great care of Jeanette's birthplace that it was a neat place to go see. You know, Jeanette kept coming back to Montana through her whole life. There were a lot of threads that weaved through it, but maybe could you share a little bit more about the place? Because us Montanans, we love to hear that Montana is kind of what forged us.
So I would say, so the land, you know, the land absolutely forged her sight, her vision, and her childhood, and, you know, really laid the foundation of who she was to become. But then it was the people of Montana that made her the leader that she was. And, you know, the thing about Jeanette was she was an incredible campaigner, right? And she was incredible at talking to people. So in the suffrage campaign for Montana, which, as you probably know, she really spearheaded. There was a movement before, but she was really able to put those pieces together and make them go in a way that hadn't been achieved before. But in making them go, she traveled the length and breadth of the state, which, as you can imagine now, would be difficult enough in a very comfortable Suburban, for instance. But
she wasn't in the Suburban,
no, she was not. She was on horseback. She was on trains, right? And she didn't have a nice sleeper car. It was just a seat. She drove in borrowed Fords in the snow up the mountain at breakneck speeds because she loved to drive really fast. Yeah, she was a flamethrower crazy. And she spoke to everyone, right? She talked to miners and lumberjacks and ranchers and ranch hands and cowboys and railroad workers and clerks and mothers and homesteaders and dryland farmers. She talked to everyone. But more than talk, she listened to them. And it was from their stories, their experiences, their wants and desires for a more representative government and a better America that she really built her platform, and she really crystallized and honed her vision for what American democracy could be. And so when you say, how did Montana forge her? It wasn't just the land, it was the people. And I think above all, that's what I took away from her legacy, that she was a great connector and a great listener and a great empathizer of people. And she really understood that we are all bound up together. And that's really the heart of what democracy is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. In Jeanette's defense, my dad, she had a lot of territory to cover, right? And my dad used to say, driving in Montana is more like a gun. You aim and fire. So that's...
Well, maybe that's why she never wanted a gun.
Maybe. One of the things I loved about your book is
you talk about her amazing legacy and the impact that she made on the world, and we're really going to dive into that tonight. But what I felt you did really remarkably well, and I can't wait for each of you to read it, is you brought us backstage into what inspired her, what forged her. And we talked about the place, but I also felt like I learned a lot about the Rankin family. And there's this concept I've always had of Jeannette Rankin, and that was that she never married and she didn't have kids. And I didn't know much about the Rankin family. We know a little bit about John Rankin, if you're aware of Missoula history. But in your book, what I really learned was she was the center of this amazing family, and that also impacted who she was. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, one of the things that you share in the book, she's one of 7 kids. One of her sisters sadly died at a young age, and that actually made a big impact on Jeanette. But her mother, Olive, kind of receded into the background. And in a way, Jeanette she was the mom of the family. It was her own family. And their lives were so interconnected. It's almost like fate was interconnected. Tell us a little bit about what it was like for Jeanette to be a Rankin and how that shaped her.
Yeah, so they were a big family, and they were a very connected family. They were also an incredibly intelligent and educated family. So she was one of 6, that's what happens, and she had 4 sisters who survived, and then her brother Wellington, that you probably all know. But all of her sisters who survived to adulthood went to college, including her. And this is in, I guess Edna graduated in 1914 or something like that. But for 5 girls, for 4 girls to go to college in that era is extraordinary, right? So you can imagine what dinner conversation was like with all these intelligent, articulate, opinionated siblings. Talk about how to figure out how to forge democracy, okay? You gotta find consensus at the dinner table, or at least civility among siblings. That's, training in and of itself. But they all really supported each other in many different ways. So Edna Rankin was an advocate for reproductive rights. Wellington was her de facto campaign manager in many ways, in addition to her chief strategist. Her other sisters were incredibly helpful, always came out and helped her. Her sister Helen, I believe, when she was elected to Congress, was her office manager. And yeah, they just rallied around each other when was needed. Then the other thing I want to address is you said Olive, receded into the background. So basically Olive, like a lot of women at that time, right? She was pregnant from 20 to 40. She was pregnant 13 times and gave birth 6 times. And by the time she gave birth to her, youngest daughter, Edna, she was quite tired. I mean, to be a rancher's wife and a businesswoman's wife is to be those things yourself and then also be a mother. There's no stopping. And so Jeanette stepped in and took a lot of those motherly duties, whether that was like making Edna lay on the table while the doctor took her tonsils out, which was super gnarly, or getting the kids to school on time, or fixing or like hemming their clothes. She was there for them. And I just do want to give a short plug to the Jeannette Rankin Foundation because, they give scholarships to women over the age of 35 or 25, I believe, in Montana and Georgia. Well, this is really important to Jeanette because she was really raising her siblings, didn't start her professional career until she was in her late 20s. And it was only then she was able to figure out who she was and what she wanted to do. And that's the case for a lot of women. And so I love that, what I wanted to represent in this book, in addition, was that women have our own timelines of success. It doesn't start at 18 and peak at 40. It can start at 50 and peak at 70, or in Jeanette's case, it can start at 28 and go up and down and up and down. And we have our own journey. So I really wanted to talk about that, as well as her deep connection to her family, without whom I don't think she would have been able to achieve all of this, because while she didn't marry, she was part of a strong and very close-knit family.
Well, I didn't have a question on this, but also you give a really interesting account of who are this incredible network of friends that she builds over time. So I was struck at her family. I was just really impressed with the Rankin family. And I want to start giving the audience, for those that don't know, kind of how did her trajectory start to go from, I'm part of this family in Missoula, Montana, to now I'm on the world stage making changes that have impacted us greatly today. Yeah. And it started kind of her taking care of the family. She was sent out east to see her brother Wellington, who was at Harvard. And can you tell a little bit about that story and also what it did to Jeanette, how it changed her?
Yeah. So Wellington, as you said, was at Harvard. I believe at the time he was in law school. And, there was a big divide, as is there less now, but still, between the East Coast, right, and the West. And Wellington really, despite being intelligent, brilliant, in fact, and incredibly hardworking, was not welcomed at Harvard because he was the man who's the son of a self-made man and not old money. And they were very cruel, very frankly cruel to him. And for a long time, he endured this, right? As an undergraduate at Harvard, he endured this. But in law school, right, the stakes were raised. Like 1/3 of Harvard Law School students at that time failed out. And Wellington, at one point, really cracked. And his roommate, who was also from Montana, found him at his desk, completely catatonic and unable to sort of rouse him from this almost coma-like state. And so he wrote home to Jeanette's family to let them know what had happened. And as the eldest and sort of only one who could go out, because unfortunately John had passed away since then, which was another contributor to Wellington's difficult mental state, Jeanette was sent out. But what happened was, basically, Wellington got better for a number of different reasons. But Jeanette was introduced to a number of things, and one of them was intellectual culture. She was an incredibly intelligent person. She'd already been to college by this point. She was from Montana State, but she didn't really enjoy it. She studied biology, but she was like, well, whatever, I don't care. And she didn't really know what she wanted to do with her life. But at Harvard, she was surrounded by books and magazines and intelligent conversation, new ideas that really lit her, imagination on fire. And the other thing that happened was she was introduced to sort of urban poverty. And while there was absolutely poverty in Montana, there was also a degree of social mobility and freedom. That wasn't true, right, in Boston at the time. They have these intense tenements that are just filled with tragedy and child labor and oppression and exploitation. And she was really taken aback by this. And, before in her childhood, she had felt like there was a problem, she could fix it, whether that was a hayloft that no longer worked and she identified what was broken and how to fix it as a 10-year-old, or that the ranch hands weren't being paid enough and she advocated to raise their pay with her father and, succeeded because she was very convincing. But here, she couldn't figure out how to fix it, and this really troubled her and set her on really the path that she went on. And so from there, eventually she had to go back to Missoula, and she had a very difficult time and developed rheumatoid arthritis at a young age. She was at this point, I believe, 27, and her family sent her to San Francisco with a sort of unnamed uncle to recover. And again, she encountered this urban poverty, but rather than helplessness and a lack of solution, she was introduced to a settlement house. This was a movement that would really put social workers at the center and living in sort of slum areas and putting social programs like schools and free lunches and medical clinics in these communities where these people lived. And Jeanette sort of stumbled on one of these houses in Telegraph Hill, which, if you know San Francisco, which I don't, and I didn't before I read this book, wrote this book rather, it was one of the poorest parts of San Francisco. And so she was walking one day and came across the Telegraph House, settlement house. And she immediately knocked on the door, and being sort of the, impassioned person that she was, volunteered to work there and ended up living and working there for a number of months. And it really started her career, not just in social activism, but also in systemic change and thinking about how we can change systems to better serve people. And we can get more into that later on if you want.
Yeah, tell us, connect the dots a little bit, because there's so much in her life, we're not going to get to it all tonight.
Yeah.
But what I really wanted to do was talk a little bit about how did she become the leader that she was on women's suffrage. So she goes and sees Wellington, and it starts this cycle in her life of wanting to participate in something bigger, understand the world bigger, get involved in helping change and affect change in areas of society that she cared deeply about. How did it focus in on women's suffrage, and how did this spark turn into the wildfire it became?
Yeah, so I'll kind of just go through it quickly and then get to the heart of your question. So basically, after she had this experience in San Francisco, she enrolled in the New York School of Philanthropy, which is now the Columbia School of Social Work. And she went to New York basically to do her graduate degree. And while she was there, okay, she's been doing social work. She has a college education, she's well read. While she is there, one of her supervisors, while she's doing social work, tells her about women's suffrage. She did not know before this point that women had been advocating and fighting for the vote. And once she knew this, first of all, she was incensed that having asked for it, women just weren't given the vote. Like, why not? And then it kind of became her life's mission to work to get women the vote. But at the same time, she was a little reluctant to jump in with both feet. And I kind of do a little bit of psychoanalysis in the book because I believe she was unconsciously concerned that once she devoted herself, it would really consume her as a passion, which it did. So she went back home after she finished her degree, and she was arguing with Wellington because he was home for summer break, and they were debating. They were both progressives, but they had different ideas of how to do it. And then he would always like give her a hard time because she was saying, "Women need the vote." He's like, "Well, why don't you go do something about that, Jeanette?" And so finally, she took him up on it.
He probably didn't say that his whole life to her. He learned after a while.
Yeah, probably. Well, so I did, Wellington. So she went to Washington State, where she again got a job at an orphanage, but that really didn't work out because again she was looking for systemic change. And so she enrolls in a few classes at Washington State University. The Rankins were all about education. They just were always at school one way or another. And she reads advertisement in the school newspaper asking for volunteers. And I love this anecdote, so I'm going to tell it. Asking for volunteers at the local suffrage office. So she goes down there and like kind of giving the newbie a hard time. They like give her a giant stack of posters. And they're like, "Yeah, hang these up, newbie." So she's like, "Okay, thanks. This is much lighter than the cords of what I'm used to carrying, and much easier than, wrangling a wild horse or whatever you do up here." Just kidding. And so she goes out and she hangs all the posters, well, she repastes them, all the posters in a day, including at a barber shop, which is like, the inner sanctum of men. Women do not go in there, and yet she's managed to hang a suffrage poster in a barber shop. And, the leaders of the Washington State suffrage movement were so impressed by her sort of determination and bravery that they really made her a point person in that particular campaign, which was successful. And then the National Suffrage Organization took note of her and made her the field secretary. And she was very instrumental in the California campaign and in a number of other suffrage campaigns before returning to Montana. And I'm happy to kind of talk about why she left the National American Women's Suffrage Association, if you like, and why Montana's different.
Yeah, I would love to hear that. And I think the audience would also love to hear about what she did in Montana that also provided the platform for women's suffrage nationally. But do that, Jeanette.
Well, okay, so the difference, so basically the NAWSA, N-A-W-S-A, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but they were an East Coast organization. And again, just like, they had a very top-down hierarchical way of organizing, and that's not what Jeanette was used to. Jeanette grew up at a time in Montana where everyone had to participate to survive. She was raising barns, She was taking care of babies. She was helping, bringing the harvest. She was doing it all. And it really formed her idea of equality in an egalitarian society. And so she was a bit at odds with the national organization's way of campaigning and organizing and advocating. And she left because she wanted to organize Montana in her own way, in a way that was particular to this state and to the West generally, but really to Montana. And so what she did was she had her headquarters in Helena, right? But then she identified precinct captains all over Montana and said to them, you talk to your community in the way that you think is most advantageous. I'm not going to intervene. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You know your community. You know your people. I trust you. And in this way, she very quickly created a constellation of power, right? That was mobile, that was flexible, and that could really turn out in mass. And so in 1911, I believe, she was invited to speak on the Montana state legislature floor on behalf of suffrage. And she received some applause, but was largely booed and laughed at, and the idea of suffrage was roundly defeated. Jeanette then organized and mobilized, and in 2 years, one election cycle, she flipped both houses of the state legislature to predominantly against, to overwhelmingly in favor, with only 2 dissenting votes in each house against women's suffrage. And then she took that, right? So this is all, it's a lot of minutia that I had to make myself with. She had to get it through both state houses, and then it goes to the ballot. And then she had to go back to campaigning and utilizing and implementing and activating this network to get it through that popular ballot. And we can also talk a bit about Anna Conicopper, maybe a little bit later, but she again, and along with her incredible network, were able to do this. And so from 1911 to 1913, they flipped Montana from being adamantly against to overwhelmingly for women's suffrage through really trailblazing grassroots organizing. That is, I think, particular to this place.
Yeah. I would like to talk about Anaconda, and I'd like to talk about it a little bit in the context of, sometimes when you don't understand history and you see somebody like Jeannette Rankin, you just think it's a straight line. But she had a lot of ups and downs in her life. Arguably, she beat the strongest power in the state at the time in the form of the Anaconda Copper Company. I think everybody from Montana is familiar with this, but they called their power in Montana the copper collar because they literally, bought and sold most of Montana to get their way. And here's this lady named Jeanette.
5-1.
Yes, yeah, 5-1. But they also, after she won suffrage in Montana and was elected to Congress, Anaconda also kind of seeded her demise from her first term. Share a little bit about that, because there is this ongoing struggle in her life, and they were part of some things that set her back. Then once I read and understood the details, I'm like, how does somebody recover from that? Yes, she does.
Yeah. So basically, the details of her election are important. So at the time, in 1916, when she was running, Montana was what's called an open state, which meant that everyone in the state got to vote for both of its congressional seats. Today, this is called a multi-member congressional district, and using ranked choice voting. And so when she was campaigning in the primary and in the general election, she was able to say, vote for your local man and vote for Jeannette Rankin. She never had to engage in partisan politics. She never had to resort to name calling. She could run a positive campaign and an issue-based campaign. And it was also not a zero-sum game, right? There wasn't this idea that if you vote for a woman, well, you're throwing away your vote because your candidate of choice isn't gonna win. You get to vote for both. You get to vote for 2. And so she was able to use this to her advantage and become in second, but still coming in second, be elected. And I believe it was Joe Walsh who was the incumbent Democrat who won that year. And it was also the year that Woodrow Wilson won. But she beat her the third place by, I over 5,000 votes, which was a huge number of votes in Montana at that time. But Anaconda also knew that she was progressive. She supported workers, she supported unions, she supported government oversight, in addition to not supporting the war, which was raging in Europe at the time, America was not yet involved in. But Anaconda Copper really profited from that war because it was the first electrified war. And copper is the best conductive of copper. And so Anaconda's, mining products ran through almost every vehicle and, a piece of electronic machinery in that war. And, they were very pro-profits, in a lot of ways very pro-war. So when she was elected, they immediately went to the Montana State Legislature, which they had in many ways bought and paid for, and said, gerrymander her out of her seat. And their slogan for this shadow campaign was, you don't want to keep a woman in office, do you? And they didn't. So they basically carved the state up to break up her diverse constituency and make sure that she could not win in the district that they had placed her in. And it was a way to not only get her out of power, but also disenfranchise her voters from having someone that they believed and did in fact represent them.
Yeah, I did not know that Montana had one, that both congressional districts came at large. And it did not surprise me at all when I learned that the Anaconda Copper Company changed the rules to get her out of office. Because if you can't beat them one way, you're going to beat them another way. And I found that very disappointing. So that's a big setback for Jeannette Rankin. But she goes on to lead women's suffrage movement for the whole country. And she not only won over the both chambers of the Montana House, but she did of the national legislature, of our Congress.
Yeah.
Share a little bit about that next stage in her career. What happened after her defeat, and where did she go from there? Because what would have stopped most of us seemed to almost fuel her.
So I'm right now, my microphone still works. I like pressed a button. I was ready to turn it off. Yes. So she was indomitable. She was unstoppable. She knew going into her first session of Congress that it would be her last. She did not care. She showed up to represent the people of Montana, and daggone, that was what she was going to do. So she introduced the 19th Amendment legislation to Congress. That would the legislation that would become the 19th Amendment. And Congress voted on it a little bit later in her term. And she worked across the aisle with a lot of different people to get it past Congress. It passed Congress by one vote. And of course, there was a committee working on sort of legislation and getting it through and moving votes and so on and so forth. And the committee suggested that she, chair the committee, because wouldn't that be great? But as both a sort of master strategist and as a person committed to not just her own sort of personal aggrandizement, but really the American people and the betterment of democracy, said, no. I can't be the chairman of this committee. It should be this Democrat of the other party that should chair it, because he's done so much work on this, and he deserves, first of all, sort of the spotlight, and he would be a better person to get this through. And it was such an act of selfishness, right? She scored 2 points. One, she was right. He was a better advocate. He had been in Congress for many terms. He had relationships. And a lot of people who were a little, wary of this young, frankly, woman, right? She's like 35 at this point. Congress is old, white, and male. And they saw what she did, and they were very impressed. So it helped really grant her welcome into this otherwise male legislative body. And eventually, she did, it was brought to a vote, and it was passed by a single vote. And it was very much because of her political acumen that it was. But just going back to this idea of ups and downs, I do want to just interject a moment of sort of what I see happen in women's history, which is women are not often afforded a hero's journey, right? We are presented as being one thing. We have a single trajectory. We don't get to fail. We don't get to learn. We don't get to grow. We're just sort of this one, we're born away and then it's continued and then we're done. And I really wanted to present Jeanette as a work in progress. And so she did have these failures. She did have these setbacks, but she continued on. And, oh, see, I have oats in the battery. I don't have another. See, we're adaptable here. Just like Jeanette. And so she went on, she decided not to allow other people to define her success. She continued to live her purpose and passion throughout the rest of her life, and her advocacy for both expanded democracy and electoral reform, and also peace, which we can absolutely talk about in more detail. That's interesting.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about your book is I don't know what it's like to live in the world as a woman. And to watch Jeannette Rankin live in a world that was particularly Congress, a world created by men, for men, that she was so adept at recognizing the forms of power and using them to her advantage. That story you just told about her pitch to Montana voters, which was vote for your local man, but then also vote for me. I just thought that was brilliant. Like her ability to make a persuasive argument inside of this strict structure was amazing. And another story you told that I had never heard, I would love you to share it with the audience, was her conversation with one of the congressmen that was not for suffrage. But could you share a little bit about her back and forth with him?
Yes, but you'll have to remind me of his name, because I forget. Oh, it's okay if you don't remember.
No,
I should have called us out.
I think it wasn't that Joseph Walsh?
No, that was, anyway,
That was in Montana.
that was in
Yeah.
Montana. Anyway,
Well,
so,
somebody in the audience might know.
yeah, somebody in that, anyway, so there was this congressman who despised suffrage. He was the one who called suffragists the iron-jawed angels, like that guy, like hated suffragists. And Jeanette, in wanting to avoid raising his ire, would always stay out of his sight line. Like she would sit behind him, so he would see her and just like get mad looking at her. But when the suffrage vote was scheduled, that day, she went to his office and she said, I'm not asking you to change your vote, but you are so persuasive and people listen to you. I'm asking you just not to speak today and just to let people vote their minds. And he said, I'm really conflicted about this, Jeanette. I don't know what I'm going to do. And she said, basically, do what your heart tells you to do. And on the floor, she sat there and she, waited and listened to the votes being counted, and she was staring at him. And he didn't get up. But the rules of Congress say that the vote is actually taken twice. And you can change your vote on the second roll call. And as the second roll call is being called, she sees him get up from his chair. And she's like, oh God, what is he doing? Is he going to sink the ship? But instead, he went up to the table where the votes were being, tallied. And he said to every single person who had voted for suffrage, he said, if you change your vote, I will change mine. And so her enemy, right, without crossing the aisle, without sacrificing their values, her adversary became her ally because their common goal was democracy. And it is such an instructive example, I believe, for our own moment, not only in our politics, in our political figures, but also in all of our own lives. And I try to think about that quite often, just sort of out in the world. How can we find common ground in our greater goals, even if our more immediate beliefs differ?
I just think she was brilliant in how she was able to move in that world. And I loved how she never used guilt.
Yeah.
She never castigated someone. Instead, she spoke like wisdom to trigger their common sense.
Yeah.
And another one that you write about is as we're fighting in World War I, one of her refrains was, we're fighting abroad for freedom and democracy. Can't we do the same thing here at home with our own people? And it's through arguments like that that I think are her brilliance, because there's lots of things I admire about her. There's a lot of things I don't agree that she did. And I'm sure that there's a lot of different perspectives in the room. But what I love about her and why I call her one of my heroes was her ability to move people. And these are just a few of the stories in your book. This book is loaded with amazing anecdotes and stories about how this amazing woman was able to pull these things off. We just have a few more minutes before we go to the audience. And I wanted to ask you a question as a Montanan, and I think I speak for the room here. We're proud to have elected the first woman to Congress. What does it say, though, that either about Montana or the national stage, that 90 years later, 54 congressional elections since, we have not sent another woman back?
So that's a great question, and it's not just Montana, right? Like, women only represent about 30% of all elected offices in this country. And why is that? It's not because women are less capable leaders. It's not because we don't want to lead. It's because our electoral politics sort of disincentivize women and discriminate against other sort of minority, non-male voices, non-white male voices. And when we look at, right, why was Jeanette able to win? It was because of the electoral systems in Montana at the time. And as Jeanette said, right, she advocated throughout her life for what Montana had, which was multiple member congressional districts, ranked choice voting, and she also advocated for abolishing the electoral system, because she believed that when the people are able to speak, they are being better able to be represented. And she believed that these systems were inhibiting people's capacity to have their voices heard in government. And so, it's gonna take, I believe, a broader view of what it means, what democracy means to solve the problems that we face today. And they're not about partisan politics. They're about quality of life and capacity to relate and ability to have our voices heard in the halls of power. So, I think, as you mentioned, right, Montana sent Jeanette back to Congress in 1939, which is fascinating to me, because she did so within the stricter sort of political system. But that's another thing about Jeanette that I find so extraordinary was...
So she ended up beating Anaconda?
No,
She did.
Yeah, she did. She did. She got the last lap.
Yeah, she got the last.
Yeah. But basically, it was a very different campaign, right? She continued to work in politics as a lobbyist, and she knew how the political system worked. So rather than staging this elaborate and broad campaign all over Montana, she went to specific precinct captains, and she got their endorsements. And then that's how she won. So she understood how the system worked, and people often ask me, what if Jeanette was alive today? And I say, without reservation, she would be president.
That's wonderful. There's so much in her life to talk about, I feel we're just scratching the surface. But if you're okay, I'd actually like to go out to the audience and let the group kind of decide where we take this discussion. Does that sound good?
Love it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, we have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions, if anybody has any. See one right here.
Thank you. I can't wait to read the book.
Thank you.
It's awesome. I'm sure most of the people here are familiar with the Capitol building, but each state is given 2 statues. And we have Jeannette Rankin right at the main entrance. Our other is Charlie Russell.
Yes.
But that really says a lot about how much respect she still has.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You know, one thing I love is that there's 2 full-size statues of her, one in Statutory Hall, but the other one is on the 2nd floor of the rotunda in the state capitol, just reminding everybody that she's still there.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Feel free to ask a question. We want to hear your questions.
Yes.
Great. I can just
If you
imagine,
use the mic.
I can just imagine you having a story.
Hold it up, Rennie, hold it up to your mouth.
Oh, okay. A storyboard, and every information you're getting from what you're reading. We were ever so lucky to find something that you hadn't read before, or that wasn't ever printed before about Jeanette.
Oh, yeah, many things, many things.
And where did you find this out then?
Yeah, so this book is the first time that all of her papers have been brought together. Thank you for affording me the opportunity to talk about this. So her papers are in Montana, obviously at the Montana State Historical Society, but also at Montana State University. They're at Swarthmore, they're at Radcliffe, and of course the University of Georgia. And because of digitization and wonderful graduate students who helped me, I was able to gather all of her archives, right, on a Google Drive and read them all. And that was the first time that was ever accomplished. Just because it's cost a lot of money, right, before to travel to all those places and to spend time. But now I can just do it all at home and pay graduate students to help me. And then the other thing was that right before I started writing, Ted Harris's family, Ted Harris was a graduate student at the University of Georgia who wrote his master's thesis on the peace work in Georgia. He had conducted hundreds of hours of oral histories with her. I mean, he just went to her house with a tape recorder and sat down and talked to her about everything. And these had just been donated and digitized. And then also, I was able to have them transcribed through, like Otter, which is just put your phone up and it breaks it down. And so, it would be impossible, right, to listen that long and glean anything from it because I was able to get them transcribed. I was able to dive into her experiences and her voice in depth in a way that I can't tell you how grateful I was to have that resource and bring it all to you. And so what I really tried to do with this book was incorporate her voice into it. And the final thing I want to say again, because, I was just really grateful for all these resources and I want you to enjoy them, was, newspapers.com has done an amazing job of digitizing American newspapers for, 150 years or whatever. And it's all keyword searchable. So for the first time, again, I didn't have to rely on whatever someone had very lovingly preserved. I was able to go in and keyword search, newspapers from California, Montana, Florida, Tennessee, New York, every state in the union. And I incorporate all of those into the book to give a sense of color and texture and also, national prominence of Jeanette. During her lifetime, particularly when she was running for Congress, she was the best known woman in the United States. And this has just been forgotten. And I wanted to bring that sense of power and prominence back to her legacy in this book. Maybe one more.
Yeah, I think time for one more.
Hi, Larry Chase. As a newer Missoulian, it's really cool to be here to hear some of the history and story of the city that we chose on purpose to move to. But in terms of that choice, there's probably a lot of fabulous, interesting women you could have chosen to write about. What was your journey to choose this one?
Well, it was a fate, I would say, fate. You know, I basically, I'll tell the whole story. So, this wasn't the first book I pitched to my editor as my follow-up for my first book. I pitched a history of the cassette tape as the role it played, unintended, in revolutions and rebellions during the Cold War, which is a super fascinating topic, and I think we should publish that book next. But they said, no, we want a book like you just wrote, which was a biography of a strong female American woman with political connotations and or political relevance. And I said, okay, but at the time, this is super personal. My stepfather was dying of glioblastoma, which is a really, you know, how do you say, aggressive form of brain cancer. And my family was just reeling, and my editors knew this, and I'm sure my editor was really bummed that she had turned down my book. But instead of having to write a whole other book pitch, because I just couldn't, this book pitch takes months of work. And she just asked for, you know, 500-word ideas about 5 different women. And Jeanette was one of those women. And I thought that they would come back and say, okay, you know, flesh out a couple of these ideas, and then we'll get back to you in a couple months or whatever. And the next week, St. Martin's got back to me and said, you know, here's your advance, write us this book about Jeanette. And so, you know, I guess just to finish on kind of a personal and spiritual note, like, this was the moment to write this book. The world needs Jeanette's voice. And a lot of things conspired to enable me and honor me to write it and to have it come out. And it was really the honor of a lifetime to write this book. So I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you.
One more question before we wrap. I would love to read the book on the cassette tape, by the way.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad for us they said no.
Yeah.
As people read the book, what do you want them to carry on around the legacy of Jeanette Rankin?
That we are all bound up together, that we are all part of a country and a world and a community, and that it takes all of us to work and to be courageous and willing to do that work. And I think a lot of times when you look at someone like Jeanette, their stars seem faded, right? That they never had to, that there was never any question, and there was never any questions in their mind. But Jeanette was, you know, rife with self-doubt and anxiety often, but she did it anyway. So I would just say, whatever change you want to affect in your life or your country or your community, regardless of whatever trepidations you feel, just do it anyway. You'll be better.
What a wonderful way to end the evening. And on behalf of everybody here, thank you again for choosing Missoula to be the place that you started this book tour. Thank you for writing this book. You'll be here for a little bit to take questions afterwards.
And sign books.
And to sign books.
Thank
I
you all.
think that's wonderful. Let's give a big round of applause for Lorissa. Is there something you want to say before we wrap up?
Somebody want a free book?
Oh, boy.